Thank you. Yeah, it's good. Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I get a chance with what I'm doing here to travel around the country, get outside, occasionally do talks in Europe and Asia, and but it's really nice to be here with such a big crowd. It's rare to get such a big crowd, and I don't think I've ever been in a crowd with so many PhDs at the end of your names, I'll tell you. Everybody up here had a PhD. It's also, I understand we have a really great live audience online. That's terrific, and having the graphic recorder is a special treat. So thanks so much for having me here, and I hope I can return the favor here. Now, what we're going to basically do is we're going to talk about the next big technology paradigm shifts. That's what you wanted me to kind of put in context now here. Because honestly, for all the tumult we've gone through with the digital revolution and all the kind of changes we've seen in the last 20 years or so, there's still a lot more running room ahead of us here. There's a lot more changes to come, and I want to put that in context. But to understand the technology changes that are happening around us and will be happening in the next 10 years or so, 10, 20 years here, we really have to step back and put it in an even bigger context. A bigger context than that. And so what I'm going to do today with you folks is do something I think is healthy for anybody, but it's particularly healthy for folks, and you're celebrating a 75th anniversary here, is to pull back from our kind of quick tweet time or what's happening in the news today. There's so much of that kind of frenetic energy in our culture. Occasionally, at the end of the week, you might pop your head up and take a look back on what happened for the week there. As a businesses, people think a little bit on 3-month cycles. As a nation, we, talk about, looking back maybe 4 years and looking ahead 4 years. What we're going to be talking about today is almost the rhythms of national history or even world history. Because when you look back at what are people in 50, 100, 150, 200 years from now, what will they look back on our era here, the early part of the 21st century? It really distills down the essence of what's happening and really gets you to focus on what's really important and what's really driving through our culture today. And now, if you do take that perspective, you got to make a case that we are going through a very rare global transformation, really on a scale that we've seen only a handful of times in world history in some respects. But from an American perspective, it's something that we've gone through only about a handful of times as well. And these are the big moments where the whole kind of culture just changes in a big, big way. Now, what happens in these moments of transformation are two major things set them off. First, you get essentially deep structural changes to the fabric of the economy or the society. So for example, we go from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. Those kind of big shifts like that. So the old way of doing things are starting broken up and not really able to function. The second thing that happens is the country faces an unprecedented challenge, something that we've never faced before. And so the old way of doing things just aren't adequate. And so what happens periodically is we have a reinvention, essentially, of what happens in this country. The reinvention of how we actually organize the economy, our society, and really the whole way we function. These are explosive times. They take about 10 to 15 years of rapid innovation, and I would argue we're in one now. Now, if you look back in American history, it's mostly an American crowd here, I understand. We went through this once in the early part of the 19th century. This is Thomas Jefferson, the founder of the Democratic Party, and there was a kind of a reworking of a much more democratized economy and society that happened right around, it was the election of 1800, his election. There was one in the middle of the 19th century there with the election of Abraham Lincoln, founder of the Republican Party. Again, he marshaled in 10 to 15 years of really explosive innovation, not just ending slavery with the Civil War, but we essentially expanded the transcontinental railroads. We had the Homestead Act that opened up the West. We had land-grant universities that popularized or got more democratized higher education, things like that. Again, an explosive situation that opened a system up for the next 50 years. We saw another one in the early 20th century around the progressive era. And again, this is Teddy Roosevelt started. Woodrow Wilson ended it. I'm saying this because this is not a partisan thing. This isn't a partisan politics thing. This is a very fundamental American thing. All Americans come through in these and actually participate in these fundamental reinventions. And ultimately, the last time we went through this was coming off the Great Depression, World War II. And the explosive innovation around there, we essentially built the system that we're basically living on today. We're in another one of those moments now. That's the way to think about it. And if you think about it, you think, we are going through, what's going on in our area here? We are going through the biggest technological transformation really this country has ever gone through at the pace that we're going at here. This movement from everything going digital, all this computerization, all these interconnections of these computers, this is a world historical thing. People will go back, again, in 100 years' time, they'll say, that's when the world went digital. Because once you go digital, everything can be reorganized. And network systems, all these new things can happen that just previously could not be done. It's a step change. It's like one of those, we're moving into a different era, essentially. That'll be recognized long term as one of huge significance. The second thing that's happening, equally big scale, is we're reorganizing the planet on a global scale. This, again, is totally unprecedented. We've always organized around cities, regions, nations at most. Now we're actually organizing so many systems at a global framework, and it's only going to increasingly get so. The other thing is we're coming up against unprecedented challenges, not the least of which is climate change. We're going to talk a little bit about that through the course of this. But it's not just that. It's like so many of our 20th century systems that were working fine in the late 20th century, even through the late 20th century, are breaking down. Our educational system doesn't seem to work, and our pension system's not working. Our healthcare system we're trying to fix in real time here. So much of this is very characteristic of the beginnings of these explosive innovation periods, which is the old systems aren't working, the new systems have to be reinvented, essentially. And so whether you like it or not, whether you like change or not, we are living through a period where we are going from, given the demographics here I can see here, folks that grew up pre-digital in the analog world, we are going to a completely digital world. In fact, we're well on our way there. We are going from a world that was pretty much organized around nations or localities to increasingly getting organized at a global level. And we are going from essentially organizing around carbon-based energy sources to increasingly throughout this century, it's going to have to move to cleaner energy sources. And ultimately, in a broader sense, which affects your guys' work too, I think we're moving from a much more, essentially an unsustainable way of manufacturing and all the different things of the 20th century to a much more sustainable kind of way in the 21st century. Something, again, has a lot to do with safety and all the different things we're learning now about how to actually protect folks too. Protect people and the planet. So what we're basically doing, in essence, is we're going finally from the 20th century to the 21st, and we have the privilege of actually doing that. Now, what I'm going to basically do today, that's a huge kind of framework. We're going to talk about 6 things in rapid succession, in very fast order here. But hopefully it's going to stretch your thinking a little bit about what's the extraordinary situation we're going through right now. One thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about, she mentioned I've been in Silicon Valley for 20 years. Was at the early Wired magazine. We're going to talk about this digital revolution, of which there is still much more to come. As much as it happened, much more is to come. And we want to give you the basic dynamics of that. We're going to talk about a piece of that I think is really important for everyone to understand, is the future of video here, which is just in its infancy, relative infancy, and it's really kicking into a new phase here. And ultimately, when you talk about technologies, you also have to talk about demographic changes. And in fact, that's a huge thing that's happening in this country. And increasingly, I think for folks in your positions, you have to be thinking, what's this next generation like and where is it going? We're going to talk a little bit about this global piece, like everything going global, that huge shift that affects everybody, even in your localities, wherever you come from the United States here. We're going to talk a little bit about climate, as controversial as that can be in some groups. We have to really talk, anybody talking about the next 10, 20, 30 years of the country has got to start wrapping their head around this extraordinary situation we're in right now. And ultimately, we're going to talk about politics, not partisan politics in any way, but in this framework I just opened up here, which is what I think our country is going to go through shortly. It's a lot of material to run through. What we're always going to be doing is spin it towards the future, looking what's next, the next 10 years in particular. So let's start right now. Now, the first thing to talk about, for people who don't know much, are not from the tech industry, and even those that are in it, it's good to remind themselves. There's a key thing that's driving the computer industry, which is called Moore's Law, which is essentially engineers have been able to get twice as many integrated circuits on a chip every 2 years. Twice as many integrated circuits, which doubles the power, drops the price, and shrinks the size of these chips. This has been going for about 30 years. It's about 10 years more we figure we can go until we start hitting some barriers of shrinking it so much you hit atomic kind of difficulties. Now, doubling is something that's very important to the computer industry, so start thinking about it. Doubling in the early days of doubling is doubling, but it's not really doing much. When doubling starts getting interesting is after it's been doubling for a while. And so then it starts to go boom, goes to that level, and then it goes boom, the next one goes boom, and then the next one goes boom through the ceiling, and then it goes 2 floors up, then it's 4 floors up, then it's 8 floors up. We're on the back end of that kind of doubling, of 30 years of this doubling in the computer industry. So if you take the first personal computer here, which some of you can remember, I'm sure, 1977, the Apple II, among others. There were some others at that time. 1 megahertz, it's essentially the kind of unit of power in a computer. It cost about $5,000 in today's terms. 30 years later, a Dell computer for $1,000 was 2 gigahertz. What that basically came down to, doing the math, is computers got 10,000 times more powerful or 10,000 times cheaper, however you want to play it like that, right? Now, if that was the car industry, we'd be driving cars for a nickel right now, right? And they'd be 2.5 cents next year. You can see how crazily disruptive that energy is. Now, if you take it another way, there's another way to measure computers is clock speed, how fast they are. They call them megaflops. If you took the fastest supercomputer of that same era, the 70s, which in this case here, we got an example here. It was basically a $31 million computer. It had about 150 megaflops was its speed. That essentially, clock speed was actually superseded by the iPad 2, and that chip was flipped in to the iPhone 4, and of course now we're 2 generations past that. So we've essentially got $31 million supercomputers. Everybody, half the people in the audience here probably have them. It's an incredible dynamic, an extremely powerful thing. Now the second thing that we've been doing is we've been connecting up all these chips, which only 20 years ago, again, most people here probably didn't even know what the internet was. And so we've been doing this in short order. Now there's a thing called the network effect, which is a pretty simple thing when you think about it, but it's worth reviewing it again here, which is that for every 1 person, if you invite 2 people into a network, how hard can that be? It's 2 people, right? Well, if those 2 people invite 2 people, you essentially have doubled the network. You've essentially exponential growth, which is the whole key about doubling, right? And if those 4 do the same thing, just 2, boom, it goes again, and then boom, it goes again, and then boom, it's through the walls, and then it's boom out to the street, and then boom, boom, boom. That's how Facebook can go from nobody knew what it was to over 1 billion people in the space of about 7 years. It's essentially this crazy network effect that's driving through things. Now, paradigm shifts, which is what you were going to talk about. Again, people might know something about this, but it's worth thinking this through. For someone like in my situation where the prediction folks are the people thinking ahead in Silicon Valley, there's this key thing you got to think about, is this is the adoption curve. Every technology basically goes through this, and you can think about it penetrating a market or penetrating a society. The first thing that happens is you get the innovators who start playing with these things early, and then that gets interesting enough where you get the early adopters who start to really play with it. And then enough people see what's going on there, and they say, oh my God, the early majority start to grab it, and then the late majority kind of jump on later, shortly, and then there's the laggards who, you can't even get a colored, a black and white television anymore, so you have to basically get the last folks on the plane here, or on the... This happens all over, all technologies go through this. Like I say, you can see it with the telephone, the radio, the TVs. Anyhow, we've been seeing it, and it's been getting faster and faster in the end here. And again, it's a very well-documented kind of phenomenon. So the paradigm shift is this, is that what happens is each of these reaches a point when it's going up that curve where suddenly, it's usually in that early adopter phase, where it's essentially you reorganize things around that new technology in such a way that the old way of doing things, you see this little new way of doing it with these early adopters, right? Or the innovators. Then you get the early adopters who show it can really start to work. And once you understand how incredibly better that is, all of a sudden you just get this whoosh. That's the paradigm shift. And that happens again and again and again. We've seen that in technologies, and we're actually seeing it. There's a lot more on the horizon we're going to see now today. Now, she mentioned I was at the Early Wired magazine. We just had our 20th anniversary just this last summer. Well, last summer, I guess it is. We're pushing 21 now. We're getting older here. But it's worth thinking 20 years ago, again, extraordinary things happened in those 20 years. 20 years ago, most people didn't know what email was or the internet was, right? And think of where we are today. For outsiders, there's been 2 booms, essentially, in the internet. There's been the first boom, was the low bandwidth boom of the 90s, where all media that could get sucked in the smaller pipes, think of it, text and photos, did so. And then there was a build out of the pipes, essentially, the broadband, and then you watched in short order the next biggest files in all media pull in. So finally, over 20 years, we went from 6% of all our information digitized in the beginning of that to essentially fully digitized today. So for folks, we hear this word big data. These are the kind of number, we've been hearing these things. Oh, everyone knows what a kilobyte or a megabyte or a gigabyte. Well, now we're getting terabytes with all this video. Look for the petabytes and the exabytes and the zettabytes. The entire world's information, all the world's information is just about approaching 2 zettabytes right now, right? Now, the reason this is interesting is the pace of change. If you go back for all of human history, since we started pounding information onto stones, basically, 8,000 BC, 10,000 years ago. If you go back that long until 2005, all of humans put together about 5 exabytes of data in that time period, right? Today we are doing 5 exabytes every 2 days. Every 2 days we're creating that much. And now the world's data is doubling. It's on that same hockey stick thing every year. We're doubling every year. And this is when you talk about big data, this is what's happening. Everything is digital and everything is doubling. And everything is essentially able to be plumbed anew. Now, so if you think about it in that big picture, the 90s we introduced these technologies. The last decade disrupted everything around it. Google and all these others, and newspapers started to collapse. All these old medias and things started collapsing. And ultimately, this is the reinvention phase, the way I would talk about it here. So anyhow, that's one way to think about it. I want to shift here quickly to video, because it has an impact, I think, on everybody that you can talk about here. And to talk about this, you have to pay a little bit of homage to Steve Jobs. Steve is, well, he's did a lot, but here's one kind of way to measure Steve Jobs' kind of vision is, this is the market capitalization of Apple and Microsoft, Microsoft being the green one, from 1990, again, the same 20-year time, from the beginning. They were basically, at the beginning, they both were equal. In the middle, by 2000, in the big dot-com boom, Microsoft stock was through the roof, and here's, Steve Jobs just chugging along with his long-term vision. Well, eventually by 2010, the vision came about. You started to see Apple became more valuable than Microsoft, and now it is the most valuable company in the world by far, even bigger than the giant oil companies, right? Well, so one of the things, so he had a vision that was really a clear thing. One of the pieces of his vision that people don't really understand fully is in every one, before he died, every one of his devices got embedded with these digital cameras. And the reason this is interesting was, in fact, we have spent 1,000,000 years perfecting how to communicate through our faces. Whether I'm smiling, kind of smiling, sweating and smiling, nervous smile, the subtlety and complexity and nuance of facial communication is huge compared to what we can do with our thumbs, right? We've been working on that for 10 years with a little smiley face once in a while. And you're wondering, what does that mean? Also, so much of what we do as human beings can't be described through your thumbs or through an email. So here's a good example. What would you rather do? Use text or want to see this in video? How to do this. You get the point. This is why there's an explosion of how-to videos on the web. I mean, YouTube is just jammed with them. And little 5-year-olds are able to watch these things and now become expert break dancers all over the world. They're like in, Thailand. Their little kids are doing all this stuff. It's crazy. So anyhow, it's because, again, the nuance and complexity of that. Now, the Google guys are really interesting in this way. They saw the long-term vision here, too, and they bought YouTube early on. And we've watched YouTube explode in the space of, again, about 7 years. Now, every day, by 2012, 4 billion YouTube videos are going off a day. 4 billion a day. There's only 6.5 billion people on the planet, right? So somebody's watching more than one. I don't know. We need a couple folks out there to fess up. Anyhow, it's an extraordinary number when you think about it. And it's just one video upload place, by the way. The other thing is the uploads, is how many uploads we're doing. We are putting into YouTube now, every 30 days, we put in more video into YouTube than all the television stations in all the world in 60 years combined, every 30 days. Now, a lot of it's crap, but a lot of it's good. But honestly, that amount of data is just incredible. Now, here's a little wonkier way, but think about it this way. Again, the same 20 years here. This is traffic on the backbone of the internet. And in the early days, before the web was even around, the web was in 0%, right? Then by the middle of the decade there, in the middle there it's 2000, The web was the lion's share of the traffic. What happened with that blue? Blue is video. 2005 is YouTube. By 2010, half of all video traffic, or half of all traffic on the backbone of the internet was video. What's really crazy is, in fact, it predicted in the middle of this decade here, just a couple years now out, they're expecting 90% of all traffic on the internet to be video. So if you're not wrapping your head around video, you're not understanding where the internet's going. It's a huge deal. Now, the thing that's really interesting about this is it's not all YouTube videos, which is essentially a one-way videos. What's interesting is it's the growth of interactive video. And Skype, here's the rise of Skype. By 2010, you already had 1 billion people on Skype, which is this one-to-one communications over video, which anyone who has a college kid, that's the way you talk to your college kid now, is through Skype. But what's really the most interesting thing that's happening is we're watching all the biggies in Silicon Valley, follow the money, are investing in group video, getting up to 10 people and now more people in the same round table, in the same kind of way that they can talk to each other, all interacting. It's getting extremely good, extremely well. Microsoft bought Skype for $8 billion 2 years ago. Anyhow, everybody's kind of seeing the kind of nuances. Now, why is this important? Okay. We go back, actually, here's the paradigm shift thing. So if you looked at the Skype one-to-one videos where people are thinking, wow, this is pretty good. It works pretty good. That was that early adopter or innovator phase. Now then the early adopters are the folks that are jumping on to this group video stuff. Mark my words, it's going to keep going up that chain. And one of the reasons is that almost all complex work, all kind of complex work happens in a room with up to 10 people looking each other in the eye, working on common documents, arguing, calming people down, negotiating, all the stuff that you can't do through email. You have to do in that face-to-face thing. And so essentially, once you can virtualize that, every cabinet meeting, every board meeting, every strategy meeting, every kind of working group actually at least has the potential to do this over video. It's a very, very powerful thing. Now, I want to leave you in this little section with an example of where this is going, because eventually Google, which has one of the best platforms on this, is now getting many, many more people, up to 150 people on these interactive platforms. And ultimately, you can see where this could be going over time. And here's an example of someone, this isn't in real time, but this is a guy, a composer, who essentially auditioned his folks through YouTube and put together essentially a very complex work of collaboration, which he essentially stitched together right here. And let's take a little look at this to give us a little glimpse of the future. One thing you'll notice is everybody in those photos, or in those videos, is under age 30. And this is a big shift. This is where we're going to shift here quickly, because to really understand technology fully or understand the future fully, you've got to understand the next generation coming up. The millennial generation. This is really the biggest generation in American history, and it is an extraordinary generation. And anyone, particularly the older generations, have got to wrap their heads around this. Now, one of the ways to think about this fast is, this is an age pyramid. This is the way demographers talk about populations in a country. The old folks are at the top, the young people at the bottom, men and women to either side there, right? The old days, they called it an age pyramid because in the old days, you had a lot of kids born and everybody kind of died in order, and you ended up with one old lady at the top, But that was before the boomers came along, of which I'm one of them, and the boomers aren't going to go. So basically, The boomers are distorting the, no, not just the boomers, it's actually biotech, genetics, all the medical advances we've gotten. Essentially, people aren't dying in the same way, which is a good thing. Anyhow, the point is, the boomers are in 2015 here are going to all be over age 50, and essentially some of them well into retirement, right? So we kind of have talked a lot about that, our society understands that. What we don't really understand is that the millennial generation is bigger than the boomers. 84 million, 83 million, and growing because they can take in immigrants. Like the boomers are not growing, they're only getting smaller. But the millennials essentially are all going to be over age 18. They will be the guts of the economy. They will be buying the homes, buying the cars, the core workers. They'll be working for you. They are what is essentially going to be America, and they also have a huge political impact with time, and they will only drive further. So you got to wrap your head around them. They're as big as essentially what the boomers did at their time. In fact, more so. So there's a bunch of ways to talk about this. I could do a whole talk on this. One is it's obvious they're completely native to the technology, so that's obvious. But what's interesting, and I know one of the themes here is collaboration for you folks. They're incredibly collaborative. They're all about teams. They can't go to the corner store without 7 of them kind of coordinating to do it. But I mean, that's a good thing because they're going to need. They're extremely civic-minded. Their levels of volunteerism are through the roof, much bigger than previous generations. They're very open to politics as opposed to the cynicism of the older generations. They're the most racially diverse generation by far. 40% of them are from different minority backgrounds. In fact, they don't see the differences in race. They really don't, anywhere near the previous generations. They're global. Many of these kids now going to particularly good colleges, literally, it's over 50, 60% of them go around, spend some time abroad. Extraordinary compared to past generations. Nothing like it, or actually one example like it around World War II, but other than that, essentially nothing like it. And essentially, whether you like it or not, they are completely tuned into climate change, environmental changes. This is a big key piece here because even if there's a debate in our society, there's no debate within this generation. And as this generation moves in, kind of makes their impact on what's ahead of us, you're going to see those values really expressed powerfully. Now, if you think about essentially the boomers, because many of the people in here I can see are boomers, as have I. The boomers were such a big generation that when they were their childhood, that life stage, they changed how it worked. You know, from Howdy Doody to Disneyland, everything kind of changed, right? Then as young adults, it was Vietnam War and rock and roll music, and everything changed around that, changed the whole culture. Then it was, the midlife too, the big expansive, big families and, big homes in the suburbs, the whole thing they wanted to do. And aging now, everyone's saying, no, they're not going to be golfing in Phoenix. They're going to be doing something totally different, right? I mean, but every time they're redefining these life stages. The same thing you got to think about with the millennials. We've already seen a huge impact in how their childhood is very different than anyone else's childhood, very overprotected. Everybody's like super educated. They got tennis lessons and piano lessons. I mean, again, there's folks that were left behind in this, but in general, they're the most overcoached, overeducated crew that you could possibly get compared to other generations. Anyhow, totally different childhood. They're now as just young adults, and we're watching very big changes happening around the culture because of them. The cities are now becoming, the downtowns of cities are just vitalized now because they don't want to live in the suburbs. They want to live in these kind of communities at the center of the city. Anyhow, tons of ways to play that out. They're actually going to continue this into midlife when they start to make more impact on politics and really how it's take more leadership in the economy. What's interesting about them is they're going to get a bonus 20 years that none of us got, basically, because essentially with the advances in biotech and other kind of medicine, genetics, understanding of it, without question by that later part of this 21st century, life will actually be longer. They could extend at least 20 years. And so we're going to watch them go across the entire century. Essentially, they will be leading, making a huge impact on America. And so as you see the handing of the baton here from boomers to millennials, wrap your head around that because it's a big shift and it's something that I think people don't really understand. Now, the second thing about it, this racial diversity piece, I think is something you got to understand too. And again, it also is the workers you are protecting, are different kind of workers. If you look out to this is projections from the Census Bureau out to 2050, the United States population growing steadily. That is the Hispanic population is going to be 30% of all Americans will essentially be Hispanic, of Hispanic origin in 2050. Now, if you took this, the way to kind of think about this is if you took the same period from, this is 1980 to 2050, if you shifted it back literally 100 years, back to 1880 and 1950, essentially you had a very similar thing, except the immigrants there were Irish, Italian, Jewish. And essentially, there was a lot of race riots and problems in the beginning of that transition. But by the end of it, we had an Irish Catholic president. We had a heartthrob of the country was, Italian Frank Sinatra, and of course, Jack Benny and other kind of Jewish comedians. I mean, anyhow, they're totally integrated in our society. And that's, I think, the way we got to start thinking about these immigration issues in new ways. The other thing is about it's not just Hispanic. We're watching this percentage of white American, of minorities of all races has been growing since the 60s. And percentage of whites coming down. As you can see, that's the America that elected Barack Obama. And ultimately, if you carry this out, conservative numbers, this isn't illegal immigration, this is just what's expected through the census. We're essentially going to have, actually some are thinking it's going to be closer to 2040, we essentially will have whites will be the minority in the country. This is California today, basically right there at that peak. That's where I'm from. It's a strange place, but it's not that strange. It's actually very, in some respects, familiar. And that's much more, I think, where we're going. Now, the final thing about this global piece is this is a global phenomenon. Young people in this country, not just millennials, but anyone under 30, is about 40%, 41% of our country. Go to the Middle East, and we'll just run around some of the countries here. Okay, that's Tunisia, 51%, Lebanon, Kuwait, Morocco, Saudi. These are the percentage under age 30. Libya, 61%. Egypt, 61%. Jordan, a lot of trouble in Syria, right? 66. Iraq, 68. Yemen. Young people, they don't really care, give a rip about the past. They don't really care about the old way of doing things. They think about the future. And so you're watching these places erupt, particularly with these new technologies. Again, it's something that's very, very interesting to see globally. Now, I'm going to touch a little bit on the global piece as we swing through our whirlwind here a little bit. And by the way, we're going to have time to talk afterwards. I'll actually have a little session later if people want to debate any of this. But the global thing is very, very interesting, again, from a tech point of view, from the tech paradigm shift. If you look back at 2000, this is the percentage of people around the world that were online in 2000. And look at that one at the front. Only 31% of people in North America were online, on the internet, in 2000. We forget about that. It was only, 14 years ago, when only 31%. But look at the rest of the regions of the world. Look at that Middle East, had basically nobody online, 1.5%, right? 2010, boom, there's the percentages, right? So we've got basically close to 80% in North America. But look what's happening in the middle there, the Middle East, again, 30%, where we were in 2000, right? So you're starting to watch this. Well, look at what's happening. So we're watching the entire world kind of do this. That's one thing to know. Second big thing, the way to think about this, is the percentage of people online in the world is about a third of the planet right now, online. Let's think of that as a pie slice, right? What's extraordinary is 3/4 of all people on the planet have a cell phone right now. Now, literally probably 15 years ago, a lot of people in this room didn't have a cell phone, right? And yet the goat herder in Africa has a cell phone right now, right? I mean, it's an extraordinary accomplishment about the diffusion, the adoption of technology, as we say. Well, what's inevitable, folks, what's inevitable going to be is everybody on this planet, except in the absolute most remote, most destitute areas, is going to get a cell phone, with the cost coming down, the extension of the network. And we know on the backs of voice cell phones, you can get rudimentary email, and the internet, they'll get access. And then on the backs of 3G, you can basically get 4G, right? And so it is inevitable that by the end of this decade, everybody on the planet will be connected with a high bandwidth connection and a $31 million supercomputer, which by that time will be about who knows what it'll be. It'll be more than $31 million supercomputer. Anyhow, extraordinary thing, and again, it's the way to think about this. By the way, it is the way Silicon Valley is thinking about this. So when you want to understand, if you have to interpret what's going on in the world here, why are they doing these things? Here's the chart to understand that. That is the population of the United States there, just 300 million. These are the monthly unique views to YouTube, 800 million, Facebook over 1 billion, and Google Now searches over 1 billion. The majority of their business is now all outside. And you saw all the growth is going to be global, right? So all the strategies now are going to this mobile strategy, and they're also going to this global strategy. So many of the moves you're watching out of these companies is like, why are they doing this? Is they're thinking about a long-term, big picture strategy. The other thing to think about for all those who are grousing about, oh my God, America is kind of losing its place in the world, don't go there. It really is not true. You take every one of the most innovative industries in the world right now, And it really is still dominated by Americans, or certainly Americans have a huge impact on those things. Anything around innovation, Americans are terrific at. There is nothing comparable to Silicon Valley. There's nothing comparable to Hollywood. There's nothing comparable to the American military. There's nothing comparable to higher education. No one's going to China for higher education. Anyhow, all the really innovative high-end pieces are American. But what's happening is we're now on the top of a global pie, right? So all these companies are reaping extraordinary rewards right now. And so what we've essentially got here from a big picture point of view is this is essentially the percentage of the economy owned by the upper 1%. We've heard this talk, and I'm not going to get very political here, but in the early part of the 20th century, when you had all the new technologies of cars, automobiles, electricity, all the stuff we know, you watched a similar situation where these titans making tons of money, taking up to 20% of the share of the economy in 1928 before the crash. Essentially, we're now back to that situation where essentially we're watching extraordinary kind of bifurcation based on this kind of new technologies, many of it, and the new ways of doing things through finance. But anyhow, this is one way, I'll say this only thing, this is why one of the discussions about tax rates is coming in here. Because you watch this is the tax rates essentially over that same time on the upper 1%. In the 50s, it was 91%. It dropped down to, it's now at about 35%. Anyhow, this is why one of the things that's actually going, the fundamentals of what's happening around the economy there. Now, we don't have a ton of time here, so I want to talk about one last thing, which can get a little touchy in some circles. But I think given the PhD level in this group here and the scientific kind of understanding that you're working on, I think it's probably, it would be less contentious than some other audiences I talk with sometimes. But here's the thing. You cannot think about the next coming decades in the world here without really starting to wrap your head around climate change. And without going into too much of the details of the front end of this, put it this way, there's these adoption curves and a meta sense that we've been through in kind of historic eras. So we watched essentially a bunch of World War II technologies, computer mainframes, atomic energy, plastics, get adopted into our society coming off World War II. We're watching now, as I've just explained to you, so much of the adoption of these computer technologies, and we're kind of finishing another decade of that going on. The next one is going to be essentially the millennial technologies are going to be different technologies. They'll still be doing computers, and there'll be advanced AI and all kinds of stuff. But really what we're going to be looking at is biotech and genetics. There's going to be a huge, huge space. If we had time, we'd talk about it. Nanotechnology, manufacturing at the atomic level. I know you folks are starting to think about the safety implications around that, which is a good thing. It's only going to get more. And ultimately, clean energy. And because there's going to be a lot of innovation around energy. Now, one of the reasons I'm coming from California, we're in a serious, this is a picture of one of our lakes. We're running out of water. It's getting very, very difficult right now. In fact, there's communities that we don't know how we're going to get them water through the year here because we're just entering we're ending our rainy season, which wasn't much rain, and we're entering the dry season right now. Anyhow, the point is it brings a point to this. There has essentially been, the basics here are that this is 1,000 years of CO2 levels in the world, and we can tell this from ice core sampling and things. That, when it ramps up as the Industrial Revolution, it has now hit essentially as high as humans have ever, since we've been on the planet, humans have ever seen the concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, but really CO2 is the main measure here. It's essentially getting to bad situation, right? We've also been able to measure global temperature rise, and the first time we were able to do that consistently was the 1880s. And so if you go back to the 1880s through to today, and this is a mean graph, so the mean is in the middle there, the 50s to 80s. Essentially, if you look at the straight line through that, it's been nothing but going up, basically, with some variation year to year, but essentially the general trend is key. We've had 10 of the last 12 years, we've had the highest years on record. There's a debate around this. We can talk a little bit about that later. But the point is, the evidence is pretty clear this is happening. It also is starting to get, very disruptive. This is 2012 alone was just with Hurricane Sandy and the droughts and the wildfires. And again, we're watching it going over and over again, these severe winters. Everyone's kind of getting in there. Anyone here, we could talk weather for the last year, for wherever you are in the country. So we got to start seriously thinking about our energy sources. And so here is essentially 100 years of energy growth in the United States from 1900 to 2000. And essentially, one thing you can see, two things to see from this thing. One, our energy growth is going through the roof. It's going totally up, which is there's more of it every year. And the other thing is the blues are carbon-based energy. The bottom one being coal, which is honestly, it's about flatlined, in some respects good. Natural gas is the next one, much cleaner than coal, by the way, and then gas there. The very top, those oranging ones and the red ones are the renewables, essentially insignificant compared to the big picture. This is global energy use from the 70s until now, with the baseline being the United States is the big black one. The red one is China, and India is the orange one. The other trend is the entire world's going up, it ain't going back. So energy use is up. So if you look at essentially where is the global energy use, this is a snapshot of how much energy the world takes in a year. It's 18 terawatts. And here it is essentially, what does it go to? What do? We do it, there's electricity is a big slice where we think, oh, electricity and transportation, that's the green and the blue. There's all kinds of other stuff we use it for. Roads, heating, cooking, manufacturing, forestry. We use a lot of energy, but it's not just about driving cars. This is where the energy is coming from globally right now. Coal is that blue one. Oil is that gray one. Plants, the absolute worst you could do, a lot of places are still burning plants, is the green one. Anyhow, the little sliver there, that yellow or that red one is nuclear, which doesn't affect the climate and is a very positive thing on climate change, and the rest is renewables, essentially insignificant. So if we're seriously look to this in the next 10 to 20 years, you're going to watch essentially a build out in some ways, and we don't know, shift to cleaner natural energy for sure, natural gas, but also I think you're going to see this build out in all these alternative energies. And again, there'll be a lot of safety implications around this, so you'll have your hands full, I think. Because I think what we're going to do is we're going to watch a reorganization, a huge thing. Now, in some respects, you could say, look at all the things we would have to do to take climate change seriously, adaptability seriously, more efficient use of energy seriously. There are so many things here. I just mentioned not to. It's essentially a building boom. It's a reorganizing society. It's a huge thing. And it is something that I think we're going to have to wrap our heads around pretty quick. Now, as we kind of wind up here, I want to bring it back to, oh my God, climate change, how are we ever going to pull that off, right? Well, here's the thing. As I said in the beginning here, we've been in this situation before. And when you go into this situation, these periods where, other periods of American history where we've had these huge problems and we've had all these changes and we don't know what the heck's going to happen, the old ways just weren't working. We did two things. You can do two things. Existentially, you can only do two things. You take who are the smartest folks you got, the human resources you can to solve this, and you combine it with the available technologies that we've got at the time, and you come up with the solutions. And we've done it every time, and we're going to basically do it again. And when you think about it that way, you go, huh, that's interesting. Because I've just been going on about how extraordinary these technologies are, right? I mean, technologies, these digital technologies have an incredible ability to scale, and how quickly I just talked to you. You can move people so fast and pull so many people together so quickly. That's a good thing. And because you can bring so many people together, you can parallel process. You can have very complicated conversations going in parallel process. You can be solving pieces of it parallel to each other and assemble all the answers later. This is what essentially server farms do on your Google searches for, it essentially takes your query, parses it into little smaller packets and reassembles it in the space of a flash of fiber optic flash, right? That's what we could actually start doing with the complex problems too, and the kind of distribution of that, of how to do that. The other thing which is extraordinary is we don't have to bring everyone to Washington or whatever it is to kind of figure it out. We can actually connect with people all over the country, all over the world. That's an extraordinary capability. And so I just want to say one thing here. You mentioned my company. I just want to give one example of just a concrete example, because I'm basically doing this on a small company. There's tons of these companies now starting to take advantage of this. I'll give you one example. I'm using this group video context. Here's me and one of my reinventors. We basically pull together innovators from around the country, around the world, top innovators, thinkers, authors, experts, entrepreneurs, out-of-the-box thinkers. And we essentially have a bunch of, we scale them into all kinds of different conversations on reinventing fundamental things of how we're going to reinventing. We just actually reinvented artificial intelligence a couple days ago. And we're reinventing higher education with Georgetown University. Anyhow, we're getting a ton of these parallel conversations going. And we're bringing them people around from all over the world. We're scaling them up kind of daily, essentially. This is now happening, right? Again, just a small little startup out of San Francisco. We just did this one I just mentioned. Oh, yeah. This is reinventing artificial intelligence, which I haven't even touched on. But essentially, our computers are now getting so powerful that when they start going about another 10 years out, we're thinking, maybe 20 max, they're essentially going to have so much power that essentially they'll start to emulate human intelligence. There's a big debate around how much they will cross over into equally intelligent as us, or even more superior, intelligent than us. But anyhow, it's a really interesting debate, which, again, keeps you on your toes here. But anyhow, I want to basically say, so there's this sense of like, still you'd think, gosh, how are we going to pull this off? It's a tough, tough, tough thing. So let's go to the last time we did this. That everybody here has some recollection of this through your grandfather, your father, your mother, your whatever. You get this story of what happened after the Great Depression, World War II. Well, here in a nutshell is what happened. Essentially, they came into the crash of '29, the Great Depression. They did not know what to do. FDR himself came in with a completely the wrong plan in the election of '32, and essentially they had to completely reverse themselves by '36. Anyhow, there was a huge kind of like, they were kind of like we are, like, how are we going to start figuring this out? They had their own issues. They had the financial collapse. They had the Great Depression, worse than what we had by far. They had to fight Hitler and fascism. They had the rise of communism. They had nuclear war. Remember this. Some of the boomers here remember this. Nuclear war. They were convinced it was going to be impossible to stop nuclear war. There was going to be isolated incidents of nuclear bombs. I can remember as a kid getting under my school, desk to kind of wait for the bombs to come in. It's like, they were actually really thought. Now, so they had these problems that were like, oh my God, how are we ever going to stop this? Well, essentially, they went to the human resource at the time. In this case, here's a bunch of old white guys in a chalk. They gave them some chalk in a room and said, figure this out. This is, this is actually, the guy in the middle there is Vannevar Bush, who's FDR's chief science advisor, who is essentially the guy credited with envisioning the World Wide Web for the first time. Someday he said all the machines will have all the world's information, they'll be interconnected some way. He didn't have, but he was the first guy credited with that actually way back in the 40s. Anyhow, they took the folks they had at the time, and they took the technologies they had at the time, and just to remember that, their technologies were like typewriter pools, right, to communicate. And in fact, think about this. We only utilized half of essentially the brain power of our society. Women weren't even really in those kind of positions that they could do much besides type, the orders of the guys. I mean, again, very different time. We forget they were handicapped in many respects compared to what we're doing. Yet what did they do? In the space of 15 years, they essentially figured out a way to get the entire economy going again with a very different approach to economics through Keynesian economics. Appropriate for their time, maybe not for ours. But anyhow, they basically defeated fascism, contained communism, and got essentially a nuclear balance that hasn't had one single nuclear bomb happen in 65 years. I mean, who would have thought that? They didn't. They were convinced it was going to take some casualties. They built an international system within 3 years. The World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, whole cloth, just boom. We have to solve this. We have to do it differently. We have to organize the economy differently, the global economy. They did it. And ultimately, they came back domestically, and they had a ton of programs that built the post-war boom. The GI Bill, the FDIC mortgages, the Social Security, all the things we know, right? Again, they did it in about 15 years, and now we look back on that, we go, oh my God, how did they pull that off? They're an extraordinary crew. It was the greatest generation. We talk about them folks, right? Well, in fact, they're really no different than us. And our era, we're in the early stages of this kind of reinvention period here. So it's murky, it's mucky, we're not sure exactly where to go, we're confused with what to do, the whole thing. It's not clear who's going to stand out in the light of history as the ways to really lead this. But anyhow, if you look at the fundamentals, I mean, just take college education. In 1940s, less than 5% of all Americans had college education. Now it's well over 30%, right? Basically, put it this way, we've got about 15 times as many. We've got 86 million, this was actually 2007, college-educated folks. Now, not that only college-educated folks can help solve situations like this, but it's still a huge thing. And remember this, we have got, as I've been laying out to you here, we have now built this extraordinary, we're going to have by the end of the decade here, full broadband wireless all over the planet. These handheld supercomputers with everybody holding with one. Everyone being able to connect it through HD video, basically to kind of interact with whoever you want ever in the world. And you're actually going to have collaboration like never before. And so if you thought about it this way, just think about if you went into FDR and his crew and you said, hey, I've got this thing here that you can ask any question in the world and get all the world's information back, prioritized in a second. He would have looked at you and gone, that's magic. And in fact, it's Google, and every 5-year-old in the country knows how to do it, right? I mean, it's an extraordinary technologies that we're on the backs of here. And so we are every bit capable of actually making this transition to this all-digital, fully digital society. We are totally capable of essentially making this transition to this much more globally interconnected society. We are able to make this transition to cleaner energies in the next 10, 20, 30 years, and ultimately also make this transition to the more sustainable way forward. And ultimately, I will say, in 50, 100, 200, 500 years from now, people will look back on the early part of the 21st century and they'll say, that's when the world went digital, that's when the world went global, that's when the world went sustainable, that's when America one more time reinvented itself and led the world into that new age. And with that, I'm going to leave you today and say, good luck in your conference. And this is me up here, and we'll be able to talk later in the side hall here. So anyhow, thank you very much. I hope you have a great conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.